Medfield TV presents Meet the Candidates, interviews with our citizens running for local offices. This series is being brought to you by the joint efforts of Carol Mayer, Town Clerk, Kevin Murphy, Medfield High School Social Studies teacher, and Aditi Tate, Cheryl Dunley, and the staff of Medfield TV. I am Connor Haskell from Medfield High School. I will be posing questions to the candidate. She will have 2 minutes to respond to each question. At the end of the questioning period, the candidate will have 2 minutes to address the TV audience. Today we are interviewing Sarah Lemke. She is a candidate running for the planning board. This position is a 5-year term. There is one position open. She is challenging Stephen Browne. Sarah, your first question is, what makes you qualified to be on the planning board?
Thanks, Connor. I'm happy to be here today. My background is as a commercial real estate attorney, so I spend a lot of my time reviewing zoning bylaws and subdivisions for my clients. And I thought it would be great to bring that experience to Medfield and to try to make an impression and impact on this personal part of my life as well. I spend a lot of time reviewing zoning bylaws in other towns, and I think that Medfield's doing a great job, but it's time for a fresh perspective and to add a little bit of youth and a woman's perspective to the board. As an attorney, I think I'm also qualified because I am trained to look at the facts that are presented and weigh the issues and not make a judgment based on a personal bias or an opinion, but weighing all of the evidence. And I hope to bring that to the board in this position.
Great. Do you think Medfield is doing a good job with their subdivisions?
I think Medfield is doing a good job. I think the challenge for a town like Medfield is to try to balance the growth that is natural and inevitable in a town like Medfield with the conservation interests and the historical preservation efforts. So I think Medfield has so far done a good job, but I'd like to keep that up. I want a certain amount of growth, particularly in the downtown and in the business districts, and support subdivisions in that regard. But I also want Medfield to maintain the character that it has had over the years and that makes it the place that I chose to live and raise my family. I think that, particularly with regard to the subdivisions that Medfield has approved over the last number of years, I'd like to see a really strong emphasis on maintaining mature trees so we don't have these subdivisions you see in other towns where a whole forest is cleared for a subdivision of residential homes. So I hope the board will continue to make that a priority over the coming years.
Awesome. What are your thoughts on the current zoning laws?
I know that the zoning bylaws were updated very extensively in 2012. Having read them and reviewed them again to prepare for this conversation, I think they are quite comprehensive and up to date. I think a couple of things we should consider to try to continue to adapt them is think about more sustainable development provisions. I think it might make sense to include a solar panel provision. There are some parts of town where it might be great to have a small solar array. It would be a good way to bring in some economic development, but still maintain some of our conservation interests. So I'd like the board and the town to consider that. In terms of those 2012 amendments, a lot of attention is being focused on the assisted living projects that may be permitted under the zoning change in a residential district. I personally don't support having assisted living or nursing homes in those districts, but I think in the downtown or in a business district they might make sense if they were appropriately sized and designed to fit into their neighborhood. So I wish that was handled a little bit differently in the zoning bylaw and something that we should consider changing going forward. I also would like to review the residential urban provisions with regard to the duplex houses coming up on South Street. I think that a few of them have been great and fit in well with the neighborhood, but I'm worried about them overtaking that small, quaint street and running them down with these kind of more dense housing.
Thank you. What do you want to accomplish in this town?
My goal is just to be, as I mentioned at the beginning, fair and honest. I think that I intend as an attorney in my background to be balanced and to not make rash or personal judgments based on something, but really to give all of the evidence a fair shot and to make my decisions that way. I also think that I would bring a fresh perspective to the board. Right now we have no women in a full voting capacity, so I would like to change that. And I think also bring a different perspective as someone who's a little bit newer to town. I've been a resident for about 8 years and have, I think, a lot of great ideas, and there are a number of people in that sort of group who are new to town whose voices are maybe not being heard and would like to be represented. I think that in terms of my personal goals for the town, as I mentioned, I'd like to promote some amount of economic development in the appropriate places and appropriately scaled, but I'd also like to really focus on conservation and keeping the open space that makes Medfield really unique. Lastly, I'd like to focus on affordable housing issues, try to find ways to have more affordable housing so that we could meet our 10% goal under 40B, but not have it, brought to us in a place where we don't want it.
Now, Sarah, is there anything you would like to say to the viewers?
The last thing I'd like to say is if you would consider voting for me, I'd really appreciate your vote. March 28th, as we said, running for the planning board for the 5-year seat against Stephen Browne, who's the incumbent. I am available for any questions if people want to hear more about me. And again, I appreciate your consideration. And thank you, Connor, for having me today.
I would wish to thank Ms. Lemke for participating in this interview show. Please remember that democracy is not a spectator sport. Please vote at the Center on Icehouse Road on Monday, March 28th from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m.
Medfield TV presents Meet the Candidates, interviews with our citizens running for local office. This series is being brought to you by the joint efforts of Carol Mayer, Town Clerk, Kevin Murphy, Medfield High School Social Studies teacher, Aditi Tate, Cheryl Dunlay, and the staff of Medfield TV. I am James Colley from Medfield High School. I will be posing questions to the candidate. He will have 2 minutes to respond to each question. At the end of the questioning period, the candidate will have 2 minutes to address the TV audience. Today we are interviewing Stephen Browne. He is a candidate running for the Planning Board. This position is for a 5-year term. There is one position open. He is the incumbent, and he has a challenger. Mr. Browne, your first question. What makes you qualified to be the head of the Planning Board?
Thank you, James. Actually, I'm not running to be head of the Planning Board. I'm running to be on the Planning Board. It turns out that the Planning Board rotates the chairman every year. It's a 5-year position. You get to do that job once every 5 years. I've done it several times, and this time I'm just running to be on the Planning Board. However, I'll still answer the question, of course. There are a couple of things. I certainly have an educational background. I did my undergraduate and graduate work in economics, and urban economics and planning was one of my special fields. So I have some technical skills that have been useful, I think, in the past. I also had business experience that's relevant. I'm a developer not of housing projects, but of renewable energy projects all over the world. And a lot of the same problems we face as a developer of those projects are the ones that are faced by the developers who come before us at the Planning Board to do things in Medfield. But I think the most important thing is my experience on the Planning Board. I've actually been doing this for over 20 years. When I thought about it, that's over 500 meetings. That's a lot of meetings. What's happened in the past turns out to be fairly relevant when you're trying to do something for the future in Medfield or any place else. And the zoning laws are reasonably complex, and the issues are complex and important in the town. So I think that experience is pretty important. And some of that experience has been on topics which have been of great interest to just about everybody in town. For instance, Med State Hospital, which is our biggest planning challenge over the next few years. That job isn't done. We fought for many years, those of us on the Planning Board and others in town, leaders in town, made sure that we had the opportunity to keep the state from doing what I think would have been a pretty bad development up there, and give us the opportunity to buy it and then figure out what we're really going to do. Also, we've worked on things like I have on open space activity, the acquisitions of the Kenny land, the Cronin land, the Holmquist land, things which have been important to the people in town. So I think that experience is probably one of the key issues that makes me qualified to be on the Planning Board and maybe in a couple of years the head of the Planning Board.
Very cool. Do you think Medfield is doing a good job with their subdivisions?
I think we're doing a pretty good job. What you have to do is to balance the rights of property owners and the developers who build things on those lands, neighbors, and the town as a whole. There are limits to what you can do in terms of controlling development, limits in state law, the U.S. Constitution, and so forth. And within those limits, we have a pretty good set of subdivision laws. One of the most important things, which we've been doing more and more over the 20 years that I've been on the board, is making sure that the people who do things, the developers, let's call them, the applicants, stick to the rules. They have to build the plan. If we approve a plan, they have to actually build that plan and not something else. They can't violate it. The other thing we have to do is try and adjust the rules over time to get better outcomes. The rules are not static. They don't have to be the same forever. For instance, I won't describe it in detail, but we've had things like pork chop lots, very strange looking lots, which somehow fit the old rules, but actually didn't give an outcome that anybody wanted. And we held hearings and then took it to town meeting, and we eliminated those sorts of things, many of those sorts of things, not all of those things, I'm sure, in the subdivision rules. And finally, I should point out that the planning board does more than just subdivisions. We also do site plan review. Subdivision is when someone typically puts in a new road and puts up 5 or 10 houses. Think of it that way. We also have site plan review, like when this studio was built, or maybe more visibly when Friendly's was changed into Dunkin' Donuts, and when Starbucks came to town, we had to look at things like traffic and lighting and impact on neighbors, drainage and all those other kinds of things. So that's also under the purview of the planning board. We also deal with open space, scenic roads, such as what has been put in place on Phillip Street and Hartford Street are under the purview of the planning board. And the building inspector and the sign committee also report to the planning board. So we do all of those things, not just subdivisions.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on the current zoning laws?
Well, we've improved them a lot over the past 20 years, but we have some more things to do. For instance, we need to put together specific zoning for Med State Hospital. Whatever we do up there, unless we do absolutely nothing, is going to require new zoning, and we'll draw on the experience of the past and understanding of the limits of the rights to control zoning. And we'll put together new zoning for Med State to make sure that the town gets whatever the town decides it really wants to have. Also, we're working on some improvements to what happens in what's called the RU, or the urban district in town. A number of houses, single-family houses, older ones, are being torn down, and 2 families are being put up in their place. Many people aren't too happy with that. And the question is, how do you put together new rules which control that to some extent, but also don't eliminate the rights of the owners to sell their property and make some good money when they leave town and go off for retirement? And finally, 40B. We've had a new 40B project in town people are aware of on West Street. We're open to the possibility of many more 40Bs coming to town. And we at the planning board, all of us on the planning board, not just me, are working on a new set of plans which should give us more protection against the unwanted form of 40Bs, but still allow us to have moderate and affordable price housing, particularly for seniors in town who need it. That's a difficult task, but it's one of the things that's on our agenda for the future. Finally, respect to the current zoning laws, let's also talk about the current zoning law regime. We have now a more professional building inspector than we had in the past. That's really important to people in town. We have a town planner, which we didn't used to have. So the infrastructure around the planning board now is a bit larger and more professional than it has been in the past. And I think that's very good for the town.
Thank you. What are your goals for the future of Medfield, Mr. Browne?
Probably I should limit that to my goals within the purview of the planning board. However, I touched on a few of them in my last answer. Let me describe them again. One of the most important ones in the planning board is helping to figure out what happens with Med State Hospital and then to make sure we get what we want. As a member of the planning board, I happen to be on the Med State Hospital Master Planning Committee, and we're even now trying to figure out what the town wants and how we do it. We don't have a plan yet, but ultimately when a plan comes out of it and when it gets approved by the annual town meeting, a big job for the planning board will be to make sure that we put the zoning in place to make sure that whatever the town wants, not what I want, but what the town wants, actually happens up there. And that's probably our biggest task over the next number of years. I did mention both the urban construction problem and the 40B problem. Those are 2 other things that I want to be sure we accomplish over the next few years. We don't need to have unlimited 40Bs coming to town, but they're very hard to prevent, as everybody knows. But there's some things we can do, and we're working on them to try and get a better answer. I'm also interested in acquiring more open space in town. The acquisitions we've done in the past have been very, very good. I mentioned a couple of them, like the Kenny property and the Cronin property. And for sure, there's lots of open space that will be part of any plan that comes out of MedState Hospital. And I think that that's something which the planning board has a role in, and I'd like to see that continue to improve in town.
Okay. Is it difficult to maintain these goals with the zoning bylaws?
I think the way I like to answer the question is to say that enforcing the zoning laws is what we're really doing. We're not really maintaining the zoning laws, we're enforcing them. Is it difficult to enforce the zoning laws? Well, actually it is. It was Thomas Jefferson, I guess, who said eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Well, you have to be constantly vigilant, not only in each individual approval or denial that you make of a development or some change in town, but also making sure that after the fact, what gets implemented is what people said they were going to do and what we approved. That isn't easy. I can tell from my own experience over the last 20 years that some of the things we wanted done, we had to work hard to make sure that it actually happened. And I won't mention individual specifics, that would be inappropriate here, I think, on TV, but it's been hard work. So vigilance is important if you're going to actually enforce the zoning laws. The other thing is you have to know what the loopholes are. When we're holding a planning board hearing, we have people who are trying to do something, let's say a developer wanting to put in a new road, and we have neighbors who may be concerned about how the road will look, what it will do to the value of their homes, what will happen to drainage, all sorts of other issues. And we have to balance the interests of both sides, which is not all that easy. But we have to look for the loopholes too, because the developers are very clever, they should be, at figuring out how to get the most they can out of the rules. Well, that's okay, they can do what's legal. We want to be sure that the loopholes are understood and we can try and control the things that are going to have the biggest negative impact on people in town. Finally, I think one other element in enforcing the laws correctly is paying attention to providing consistency and establishing the right precedents. In any individual case, when someone comes before us, there sometimes is a temptation, and we're always asked, will you give us this waiver? Can we do this? Can we make some change? Can we go a little bit past the law here? We try and avoid that because you want to send a consistent signal to people, this is what we require, this is what the laws say. If you want to change the laws, go to town meeting and change the laws. But this is what they say and you can't do more. In other words, you have to make sure that what you allow will stick. If you give lots of variances all over town, then when you actually want to control something, it won't stick legally. So that's something that we've worked hard on. And I must say, the planning board we have today in town is outstanding. Not counting myself, we have people with a lot of experience. We have new people who have come up, one person in particular who's come up through the associate approach, so he's attended a lot of meetings as an associate member, and now is a member running for a 3-year slot. By the way, you should vote for him when I hope you vote for me, and that's Paul McKechnie. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to address the TV audience now?
No, I think I've said what I need to say. I believe I have the experience in the planning board to continue to do things in town which will make us a better town, preserve the character as much as we can, but also make sure that we allow that development in town which meets the needs of some of the interest groups in town, seniors and the millennials and others.
I wish to thank Mr. Browne for participating in this interview show. Please remember that democracy is not a spectator sport. Please vote at the Center on Icehouse Road on Monday, March 28th from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m.
The preceding was a production of Medfield TV, Community Show.